What would Jimi Hendrix have thought of Eddie Van Halen? Let's talk about it. Alright, so when I ask this question, I want to point out first of all that I mean specifically, how would Jimi Hendrix have reacted to Eddie Van Halen's guitar playing? I don't mean, would Jimi Hendrix have necessarily liked the band Van Halen? I think those are two entirely different questions, and they may have two entirely different answers. But in terms of what would Jimi have thought of Eddie Van Halen's guitar playing, I actually think there are some clues out there that can help us track down the likely answer. But before I do that, I'd like to remind you to like and subscribe to the channel. I upload new content basically every day, and we have a lot of interesting polls and discussions going over in the community section of the channel, so I hope you'll check those out. Alright, now back to what would Jimi Hendrix have thought of Eddie Van Halen's guitar playing. Well, the first clue that I think we should keep in mind is that while Hendrix clearly could never offer his direct opinion of Eddie Van Halen, he did offer opinions of two guitar players that I think are very important in this connection. One is Jeff Beck, and the other is Billy Gibbons. So back in the day, Hendrix and Jeff Beck had a conversation about the future of Jeff Beck's guitar playing, believe it or not. And in this conversation, Hendrix told Jeff Beck that he thought it would be a much better idea for Jeff to play fusion style music and soundscape type music and psychedelic music. Way better idea for him to do that than to play straight blues guitar. Now, in regard to Billy Gibbons, Hendrix was on record at one point of saying that he thought Billy Gibbons was his favorite guitar player. And this is interesting because Billy Gibbons is such a deeply blues influenced player that it would seem like this contradicts what he said to Jeff Beck. Let's stop and think about this for a minute. What he was saying to Jeff Beck basically was, find your own voice, see where your own style takes you, and forge new ground. What he was saying about Billy Gibbons is, what an excellent, schooled blues player with a lot of really great riffs and that clearly with the right style and attitude. In other words, Gibbons was putting his own twist on the blues, and Hendrix saw Jeff Beck potentially putting his own twist on the guitar through his use of experimental and psychedelic work. Now, what does any of this have to do with how Hendrix might have viewed Van Halen? Actually, it has a lot to do with it, because if you think about what I just said, Hendrix prioritized guitarists who found their own voice. One other thing to point out is that Hendrix was also well known as being a fan of Leslie West. They even jammed together a couple times famously back in the day. He loved the band Mountain, and in fact, here's a little story told by Leslie West.
And Felix says to me, go ask Jimmy to come in and listen to it. I said, you're asking me to ask him? I mean, I'm a punk kid from Forest Hills, New York. What am I gonna, Jimi Hendrix? So, what do I have to lose? So I walk in, I say, Mr. Hendrix, Felix Bavalori would like you to come in and listen to our album. It's finished. And he comes in, and Never in My Life's on our first track on that. And he hears me doing the riff. He looks at me, he says, that's a great riff, man. As soon as he said that to me, none of my friends could talk to me again. I mean,
so he loved the riff that Leslie West played for him, and of course his compliment made Leslie West's head swell up. But the basic idea, what I want to take away from this, is that Hendrix was very much into riffs, and if you look at some of his own songs like Purple Haze or Dolly Dagger or Easy Rider or any of his rock songs, he had a knack for riff writing. So I think here's three things we can take away from comments that we know Hendrix made. One, he prioritized and really liked guitar players who found their own style. Two, he really liked guitar players who had a riff-centered approach. And three, he liked guitar players who pushed the boundaries. Well, Eddie Van Halen clicks every one of those boxes. So in my opinion, my feeling is Hendrix would have really loved Eddie Van Halen as a guitar player. I don't think that he necessarily would have fixated on the tapping technique like so many people do, but I think he would have seen what a gifted guitar player, technician, and visionary that Eddie actually was. Now, on the second part of this question, what might have Hendrix thought of Van Halen the band? On this one, I'm going to take a bit of a divergence, and I'm going to say I'm not sure he would have been a big fan of the early Van Halen albums, and primarily I think this would have had to do with David Lee Roth. I don't think that Jimi really would have been buying what Dave was selling. Whether you like him or not as a vocalist, his primary contribution to the band was his theatrical nature and his over-the-top persona. And in my opinion, Hendrix might have found that more comical than effective. Anyway, this is what I think, but what really matters is what you think. So if you have an idea about this or any other topic connected to classic or contemporary music, please drop it in the section below. And remember to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot.